Poor girl went for a job interview, but the billionaire CEO fell in love at first sight and married her instantly. Some days begin like any other. And then there's the day everything changes. It starts with a voice raised at an old woman and a girl who dares to say, "That's enough." She doesn't know she's being watched. But she doesn't know that kindness is the one thing that could break a heart trained never to feel. By sundown, the stranger in the shadows will call her his wife, and for the first time in her life, she'll wonder if being chosen means being loved. The girl who didn't look back. Some mornings carry a kind of silence that feels like warning. The streets of Chicago were still wet from the early rain, glistening under a gray sky that didn't know whether it wanted to clear or cry. Anne Reed stood at the corner of Wabash and Monroe, her resume folded neatly inside a plastic sleeve she'd used since high school. The heels she wore weren't hers, borrowed from a neighbor, and the coat on her shoulders had a missing button, but she'd walked out the door with one thing fully intact: her hope. Johnson Group was holding interviews for junior office staff, and Anne had waited 2 weeks for her appointment. She hadn't told her mother there was no point in adding hope to a heart already too tired. They barely had enough for her father's medication this week. If this didn't work out, she'd have to sell her violin. Again, as she crossed the street, she saw it happen. An elderly woman, frail and hunched with a shopping cart, was being yelled at by a younger woman in high heels. A luxury car idled behind her, its horn blaring impatiently. The younger woman was dressed in designer from head to toe, shouting as if the woman's presence was a personal offense. "This is Johnson Group property. Who let beggars in here?" Anne didn't think, she just moved. She reached the woman quietly and placed a gentle hand on her back. "Ma'am, are you okay?" The woman nodded slowly, embarrassed more than anything. But before Anne could lead her away, the high-heeled woman spun on her. "What do you think you're doing?" Anne looked her in the eye. Her voice didn't shake. "I think you should apologize." A hush swept over the small crowd that had started to form near the entrance. Security guards exchanged uneasy glances. The woman narrowed her eyes. You know who I am?" Anne shook her head. "No, but I know who I am." The slap never landed, though her hand did rise. Instead, the crowd parted as the elevator doors opened behind the glass wall. The man inside stepped forward slowly, his black overcoat still dotted with drops of rain. His eyes were unreadable, his presence heavier than the sky itself. He looked first at Anne, then at the elderly woman, then, without a word, turned to the woman in heels. "You're not welcome here," he said calmly. "Leave." The woman paled. Mr. Johnson," she insulted. But he had already turned away. "Miss," he said, addressing Anne, "come inside." Anne blinked. "Me?" He didn't answer. He simply pressed the elevator button again. As the doors slid open, Anne looked back at the old woman, then forward toward the man who had just silenced the street with a single sentence. She stepped inside, and the world she knew, every dollar she'd counted, every compromise she'd swallowed, vanished with the closing of the doors. The ride was quiet. Anne stood on one side, her fingers gripping the strap of her canvas bag. The man beside her didn't speak, didn't move. He stared ahead, the tension in his jaw sharp enough to draw lines in glass. She didn't know who he was, not really, just that he had power and he had seen something she hadn't tried to show. At the 15th floor, the doors opened. He stepped out first. She hesitated. "Weren't worry," he said without turning back. "You're not in trouble." Anne exhaled. That evening, Anne would walk home with a mind spinning in ways she didn't understand. She would think of how the man Charles Johnson, CEO of Johnson Group, had called someone in HR and said, "Find out who she is." How he had told them to offer her a position she hadn't applied for. And how his eyes, cold and precise, had lingered not with desire, but recognition. And that night, Anne would sit by her father's hospital bed, holding the receipt for a $2,000 0-cent deposit she couldn't afford, wondering how a single moment of kindness had changed everything. But for now, inside the building that touched the sky, a girl who once thought no one saw her was being watched by the most powerful man in the room. And he was not about to let her walk away. Chapter 1. The Girl in the Elevator. The ride to the 15th floor took less than 30 seconds. But Anne Reed would remember every breath of it. The silence between her and the man in the black overcoat was dense, like the kind that falls just before a thunderstorm. He didn't look at her, didn't ask her name, just stood there, tall, still, sharp-featured, with his hands in his pockets and the weight of a dozen decisions behind his eyes. Anne tried not to glance his way, but she couldn't help it. His presence filled the elevator in a way that made her feel like a character in someone else's movie. 15th floor, the robotic voice finally chimed. The doors opened to a wide hallway lined in glass and gray. He stepped out first. Anne remained frozen in place. "Miss Reed?" he said over his shoulder. She startled. "How do you—" But he was already walking. Anne hurried to catch up, her footsteps light against the marble. "Excuse me, sir, Mr. Johnson." "Charles Johnson," he said without slowing. Of course, that name, the name on the building, the man in the business articles her father used to read aloud, the youngest CEO in Johnson Group history, the one with the tragic backstory, the one rumored to be allergic to love. She felt small walking behind him, small but not invisible. They arrived at a sleek office door. He didn't knock, just opened it, and gestured for her to enter. The room was empty, save for a long table, floor-to-ceiling windows, and a carafe of water that looked like it had been poured by a machine. Anne stood near the door, unsure. Charles moved to the far end of the table, turned and faced her with eyes like winter steel. "You spoke up for someone who had no voice." Anne swallowed. "Anyone would have done the same." "That's not true." She didn't know what to say, so she said nothing. Charles studied her for a beat longer, then picked up his phone. "Diane, pull Miss Reed's resume. She'll be applying for the assistant opening on my floor." "Yes, today." Anne's heart kicked. "Wait, I didn't—" He looked up. "You said you were here for an interview, weren't you?" She nodded slowly. "Yes, but not for that kind of position. I'm not qualified." He tilted his head slightly. "Are you honest? Do you have integrity?" "I try." "Do you take bribes?" Her eyes widened. "No." "Good, then you're overqualified." 10 minutes later, Anne found herself being ushered out by an assistant with silver hair and kind eyes. "We'll finalize your paperwork later this week," the woman said, handing Anne a small folder. "And congratulations, it's not every day the CEO hires someone on the spot." Anne could only nod. She stepped back into the elevator, folder pressed to her chest like armor. Her reflection stared back at her from the mirrored walls, wind-ruffled hair, worn heels, eyes that hadn't known sleep in days. And yet, "You're not invisible," she whispered to herself. Back on the street, the city felt louder than it had an hour ago. But something had shifted. The sky had begun to clear, just slightly, as though the rain had been part of some quiet cleansing. Anne walked past the spot where the confrontation had happened earlier. The elderly woman was gone. So was the crowd. But the echo of her own voice still lingered there. "I think you should apologize." It had been reckless. It had almost cost her everything. And somehow, it had given her something more. By nightfall, her father's fever had worsened. The nurse on shift said they'd need to run additional tests. Anne held his hand gently, wondering how she could possibly pay for it. Her mother sat quietly in the corner, knitting a blanket no one had asked for, trying not to cry. Anne stepped into the hallway, the cool light of the hospital dim against her. Inside was a formal offer letter, Johnson Group letterhead, a salary 3 times what she'd ever earned before, and beneath it, a note, scribbled in faint, rushed handwriting. "Integrity is rare. Consider this my investment." She stared at it until her vision blurred. The next morning, Anne showed up at Johnson Group 10 minutes early. This time, she didn't hesitate before stepping into the elevator. And this time, she wasn't alone. Because, as the doors slid shut, Charles Johnson was already inside. He looked at her, just briefly. Then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. "Good morning, Miss Reed." She straightened her shoulders. "Good morning, Mr. Johnson." Stories don't begin with love. They begin with dignity, with kindness, with someone choosing to see. Anne didn't know what was coming. Not the rumors, not the sabotage, not the contract he would soon offer her, the one that would change everything. But in that moment, inside the elevator that smelled faintly of citrus and rain, a billionaire CEO who trusted no one had just made space for a girl who trusted everyone. And nothing would ever be the same again. Chapter 2: The application they tried to erase. By Monday morning, the walls of Johnson Group were already whispering. It started as a murmur in the HR department, quiet, clipped sentences behind locked office doors. By 9:15 IMN, the murmur had become a buzz. By 10 o'clock, it had a name. Anne Reed. She just appeared, someone whispered by the coffee machine. No resume in the system, no credentials, yet she's already on the executive floor. Charles Johnson requested her directly, another added. He never hires anyone himself, ever. In a corner office on the 7th floor, Melissa Grant tightened her grip on her phone. She hadn't slept since Friday. She'd seen that girl Anne get into the elevator with Charles, had seen him ignore her for the first time in months, and now the girl was working upstairs? Not if she could help it. Anne didn't know any of that. She stood in a long hallway outside the executive wing, trying to steady her breathing. She wore the same coat with the missing button, a freshly ironed blouse, and shoes that still pinched. The folder in her hands trembled slightly. Across the hall, Charles's assistant smiled and opened the door to a quiet meeting room. "They'll bring your ID badge shortly," she said kindly. "For now, Mr. Johnson wants you to observe the team briefing." Anne nodded, unsure what that meant. She stepped inside. The room was already half full, men and women in sleek suits, iPads open, voices low and confident. The moment she entered, heads turned, conversations stopped. She smiled awkwardly and moved to the back corner, sitting as quietly as possible. But her presence wasn't going unnoticed. Downstairs, Melissa burst into the Human Resources Director's office without knocking. "Who authorized the onboarding of Anne Reed?" she snapped. Mr. Darlington blinked behind his glasses. Miss Grant, that came from upstairs." "I know it came from upstairs. But where's her file, her background check, her references?" He hesitated. "I believe it's still being processed." "No, you deleted her. You disqualified her last week because of me. Because I told you she was inappropriate for this company." Mr. Darlington looked uncomfortable. "Then, something must have changed." "Change it back," she said through clenched teeth. "Or change jobs." He swallowed hard. Back upstairs, Anne tried to focus. The presentation on quarterly revenue was full of acronyms and departments she didn't understand. Her pen hovered above the page, blank. She felt heat rising to her cheeks. Suddenly the door opened. Charles Johnson walked in. Everyone stood, immediate. But when his eyes swept the room, they stopped at Anne. She stood slowly, heart thudding. "Continue," he said to the speaker. Then, to Anne, "Stay after." That was all. He took his seat. Anne tried not to let her mind spiral. 20 minutes later, the room emptied. Charles remained seated, reviewing something on his tablet. Anne lingered near the doorway. "Miss Reed," he said without looking up, "you'll be shadowing my schedule this week. Meetings, calls, travel prep. I want to see how you observe." She nodded. "Thank you." Anyone questions why you're here," he added, setting the tablet down. "Tell them it was my decision." Anne hesitated. "Sir, there may be pushback. I don't want to cause trouble." He looked up at her, and for a brief second his expression cracked, just slightly. Something unreadable flickered behind his eyes. "You're not the one causing trouble," he said. "You're just the reason they're showing who they've always been." Anne didn't fully understand what he meant, but she nodded. At noon, she was stopped in the hallway. A woman with curled blonde hair and a blazer too sharp for the weather blocked her path. "You're Anne, right?" Anne nodded. "I'm Melissa Grant, Charles's friend." And she said the word like it came with a crown. Anne gave a polite smile. "Nice to meet you. You're working here now?" "I am." Melissa's smile didn't reach her eyes. "It's brave, walking into a building where you don't belong." Anne tilted her head. "I think that depends on who deciding who belongs." Melissa stepped closer. "Let me make something clear. This company isn't a charity. You don't get to play Cinderella just because Charles held a door open." Anne bit and flinch. "Thank you for your opinion," she said softly, "but I didn't ask for it." She stepped around her and kept walking. Melissa watched her go, her hands curled into fists. That night, Charles Johnson reviewed the company's security logs. 2 requests had been made to remove Anne Reid's employment file, and from the HR director, and Melissa. He stared at the screen for a long time, then picked up his phone. "So Darlington," he said coldly, "you're fired." Meanwhile, Anne sat at her father's bedside. He was asleep again, but his face had relaxed for the first time in days. The nurse had said he was responding well to the new treatment. It wouldn't last without payment, but it was something. Anne checked her phone. Nothing from the hospital's billing department yet. No miracle offers. But she had the job. And in the silence of that hospital room, lit only by the glow of machines, she whispered a promise. "I'm going to protect us, no matter what." Back in his penthouse suite, Charles stood before a floor-to-ceiling window, a glass of something dark in his hand. A city glowed below. But his mind was not on business tonight. It was on the girl who'd looked him in the eye and said, "No," without flinching. The girl who didn't ask to be saved but stood tall when no one else would. He wasn't sure what was drawing him to her. But he knew this. It wasn't charity, it wasn't pity, and it wasn't some performance of honor. It's something else. Something real. Chapter 3. She's the CEO's fiancé? Hold on. Anne never intended to become a rumor. But by Tuesday morning, she was the headline of every whispered conversation on the executive floor. They didn't say her name outright, at least not yet. But phrases like, "the new girl," "the one in the elevator," and "the assistant Charles hired himself" were everywhere. Especially in the corporate break room. Especially with Melissa Grant standing in the middle of it. "I heard she didn't even submit a full application," whispered a junior manager. "She just waltzed in from nowhere," another added, "and now she's working directly under Charles Johnson?" "Under him," Melissa said coolly, sipping her latte. Interesting choice of words. The room fell quiet. Melissa didn't smile. She didn't need to. The look in her eyes was enough. "Let me be perfectly clear," she continued, glancing around. "Charles Johnson is many things, but impulsive isn't one of them. He doesn't make personal decisions at work, so whatever that girl is doing here, it won't last." And someone chuckled nervously. No one disagreed. But then the elevator dinged, and Anne stepped inside. Anne paused in the doorway of the break room, uncertain. She had been sent to retrieve a document from the assistant's desk, but a voice had drawn her toward the low hum of conversation. She hadn't expected to walk into the middle of it. She felt their eyes. But she didn't back away. "Hi," she said calmly, her voice clear. "Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt." Melissa turned slowly. "We at all," she said, stepping forward. "We were just talking about you." Anne met her gaze. "Then I'm glad I walked in." Melissa's smile curled like the edge of a blade. "Tell us," she said, loudly enough for everyone to hear. "How does it feel to be the CEO's personal charity project?" A few heads turned sharply. Anne blinked, once. "I wouldn't know," she said. "I'm just doing the job I was asked to do." Melissa took a step closer. "You should enjoy the attention while it lasts. Charles tends to grow bored quickly, especially with women who mistake pity for love." The room fell silent, and then said, "Melissa." His voice cut through the air like ice. Charles Johnson stood in the doorway, his gaze unreadable. Anne turned, startled. Melissa stiffened. Charles stepped into. "You're needed in my office." Anne nodded slowly. "Yes, sir." But before she could pass, Melissa spoke again, softly, bitterly. "Charles, this is what you call professional? She's not even wearing a name badge." He looked at her for the first time that morning. Not with fondness, not even with anger, just emptiness. "Melissa," he said, "stop embarrassing yourself." And froze. "And for the record," he added as Anne passed him, "this isn't pity." "Then what is it?" Melissa asked, her voice sharp with something between desperation and disbelief. Charles paused. He looked at Anne again, and his voice lowered. "It's intention." Back in his office, the door clicked shut behind them. Anne stood by the desk, her hands folded carefully in front of her. Her heart hadn't stopped racing. Charles removed his jacket, set it on the back of his chair, and turned to face her. "I apologize," he said simply. She blinked. "For what?" "Making you a target." Anne hesitated. "I don't mind rumors, Mr. Johnson. I've lived through worse." He walked to the window, his back to her now. "Melissa is dangerous when provoked. You'll need to be careful." Anne tilted her head. "You're worried?" He didn't answer right away. Then, "You shouldn't have to defend your worth in a building like this." Anne's voice was gentle. "And yet, I do." Charles turned. He studied her for a long moment, really looked at her. Not as an assistant, not as a complication. Just a woman with a spine made of something he hadn't seen in years. "Would it help if I gave them a reason?" Anne's brows lifted. "A reason?" He stepped forward. "I introduced you not as my assistant, but as something else." Anne stiffened. "You mean fiancé?" The room went still. Anne stared at him, disbelieving. "You're joking." "I'm not." "Mr. Johnson, you don't even know me." "We hasn't stopped anyone else from making assumptions." She felt her chest tighten. "And what would I be to you then? A performance?" Charles didn't flinch. "Or protection." There was a silence between them that felt like standing on the edge of something high and permanent. Anne exhaled. "I say no? Then you remain my assistant, and I continue cleaning up the messes people like Melissa leave behind." Anne stepped toward the door. Her hand hovered over the handle. "If I say yes?" Charles's voice was low. "Then I won't let anyone touch you again." The next day, Anne walked into the office wearing a small silver pin on her lapel. It wasn't a name badge. It was the Johnson family crest. And Melissa saw it. And Melissa knew. By the end of the week, the headlines in the corridors had changed. She was no longer the assistant. Now she was the fiancée. And Anne, who had once felt invisible, was now the most talked about woman in the building. But no one asked her how she felt about it. No one knew what it was costing her to play along. Only Charles saw the way she looked at the world, like she didn't trust it to stay kind. Only Charles knew the truth behind the silver pin, that it wasn't a symbol of power. It was a shield. And he had put it there himself. Chapter 4. The Store Incident. Anne didn't belong in this part of town. The boutique windows gleamed like polished secrets, elegant and cold. Inside, everything was marble and minimalist, as if even the mannequins had been trained not to breathe too loudly. She had come for one reason only, to buy Charles Johnson a tailored suit for the upcoming press event. It wasn't her idea. You're his assistant and his fiancée, his secretary had said lightly. You're allowed to help him look the part. Anne had smiled, nodded, and tucked a request into her mental drawer of surreal tasks. She wasn't used to this world, the one where someone like her bought silk-lined suits for a man who owned half the city. She gripped the tiny envelope in her hand. Charles had given it to her quietly before his afternoon meetings. I insist on buying it yourself. Use this. A black platinum card. She hadn't even known they existed. Inside the boutique, the silence was expensive. A few men lounged in velvet chairs while attendants fluttered around them. Anne stepped hesitantly toward the front counter. Can I help you? A tall woman in red lipstick asked, eyes immediately scanning Anne's coat, shoes, and hands. I'm here to purchase a suit for my fiancé, Anne said. The words still felt foreign in her mouth. The woman blinked. Do you have an appointment? No, but I was told this location carried custom pieces from the Ermenegildo Xenia line. The woman didn't answer right away. Then she smiled, but it wasn't warm. This line starts at $12,000 0 cents. Anne nodded. That's fine. The woman's smile faltered slightly. Very well. Do you know his measurements? Anne opened her phone and showed the note Charles had texted her. The woman glanced at it, then waved her hand toward a younger associate. Camilla, assist this guest. Anne followed the girl deeper into the boutique. She didn't notice the other woman reaching for her phone. Melissa stepped into the store 10 minutes later. She wasn't here to shop. She was here because her phone had buzzed. She's here, the message had read, trying to buy a Zegna suit, alone. Melissa didn't bother hiding her satisfaction. She found Anne near a full-length mirror, awkwardly running her hands over a jacket sleeve. Want a surprise? Melissa said, voice sharp. Anne turned, startled. Melissa, I thoughtful of you. Shopping for Charles? Anne gave a careful nod. Yes. Melissa's eyes flicked to the tag Anne had just glanced at. $18,500 0 cents. Do you even know what this fabric is? Anne straightened. Vicuna. It's rare and heat-regulating, light but warmer than wool. Melissa's lips parted, just for a moment. She hadn't expected a correct answer. Interesting. Still, suits like this aren't for women like you. Or men like Charles, for that matter. Anne frowned. He wears these often. Oh? We wore them for me, Melissa snapped. When we traveled to Milan, when I was the one beside him, not some charity case from the elevator. Anne stayed quiet. Melissa stepped closer. You're clinging to something that doesn't belong to you. I'm not clinging to anything, Anne said softly. I was asked to be here. It was money. Anne hesitated. Melissa smiled. That's what I thought. She turned to the sales clerk. Cancel the transaction. She doesn't have the means. Actually, a new voice cut in. She does. They all turned. Charles Johnson stood in the doorway. He walked in without urgency, his coat draped over one arm, eyes locked on Melissa. What are you doing here? He asked. Melissa blinked. I could ask you the same. I was meeting Anne for lunch, and now I'm meeting her here. Anne's heart stammered. Charles turned to the sales clerk and extended his hand. Card, please. Anne handed it over silently. Charles held it up for Melissa to see. Still thinks she can't afford it? Melissa's jaw clenched. Charles turned to Anne. Find one you like, or two. Charles, you can't be serious, Melissa said, her voice rising. She's your assistant. This is unprofessional. You're right, he said, which is why I'm correcting the record. He took Anne's hand in his calmly, decisively. Anne isn't just my assistant, he said clearly. She's my fiancée. I silence. Even the background music seemed to hold its breath. Melissa looked like she'd been slapped. You're lying. Charles stepped closer to Anne. "I were would I do this?" He leaned down and kissed her lightly but without hesitation. A kiss meant to end questions, a kiss meant to burn bridges. Anne barely had time to react. When he pulled back, Melissa was gone. They exited the store together 10 minutes later. Anne clutched the receipt, still stunned. "You didn't have to do that," she said. Charles didn't look at her. "I know." "Why?" "Well, because no one humiliates you in front of me. Ever." Anne looked at him then, for real. There was something fierce in him. Not rage, not even possession. Just protection? "This isn't real," she whispered. "You know that, right?" Charles finally met her gaze. "That's the problem," he said quietly. "It's starting to feel like it is." Chapter 5. Terms of the deal. Anne had never climbed stairs this slowly in her life. It was past midnight when she returned to the apartment she shared with her mother. The hallway light flickered. Her heels clicked softly against the faded tile. She pressed her key into the lock and paused. Behind the door, she could hear her mother coughing. A dry, gasping kind of cough. The one that came when the pain medication was overdue. Anne's chest tightened. She pushed the door open. "Mom?" she whispered. "Annie?" Her mother sat up on the couch, eyes glassy. "You're home late." Anne set her bag down and moved to her. "Let me get you your meds. You need to sleep." "Did you get the job?" her mother asked, her voice hopeful but weary. Anne nodded, then lied. "Yeah, office work, entry level, nothing fancy." Her mother smiled, proud as ever. "I knew you would. You're just like your father, quiet but stubborn." Anne helped her lie down, tucked the blanket gently around her, and sat beside her for a moment, watching her breathe, wondering how much longer she could hold everything together. The next morning, she stood in front of Charles Johnson's office with her hands folded. The door was open. "Come in," he said, without looking up. She did. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Have a seat." Anne sat. She didn't speak right away. Charles glanced up, studying her expression. "You didn't sleep." "Neither did you," she said softly. A flicker of something passed through his eyes. Amusement, maybe, or fatigue. He leaned back in his chair. "I assume this is about last night." "You kissed me in public, Mr. Johnson." "I called me your fiancé." "Also true." Ian inhaled. "Why?" He looked at her, unblinking. "Because it shut everyone up." She tilted her head. "Is that all I am to you, a shield?" "You don't want to be here," he replied calmly. "You hate this kind of attention, but you showed up anyway. You did your job. You defended an old woman on the street without asking who was watching. I need someone like that standing next to me right now." Olivia asked. "A contract?" Charles nodded slowly. "That's exactly what it is." Anne leaned back. "Then let's be honest," she said. "My father's in the hospital. He needs surgery. We can't afford it." Charles didn't flinch. "How much?" $200,000. He didn't blink. "I'll transfer it this afternoon." Anne stared at him. "Just like that? Which conditions?" "Of course." He stood, walked to the window. The city was shimmering in the distance, bright and unaware. "You'll attend events with me. Galas, board dinners. We'll live in the same space. We'll act married in public, and you'll sign a confidentiality clause." Anne's voice was quiet, and in private, he turned to face her. "We keep our distance." She exhaled. "How long does this arrangement last?" "Until I say otherwise." Anne stood slowly. "And when you get tired of me?" Charles's voice was quiet but direct. "Then I set you free, with your name cleared and your family taken care of." She walked toward the door, then stopped. "And what if I fall for you?" That caught him. His answer came a little too late. Lyndon's eyes. By the end of the day, Anne had signed the papers. The bank transfer came through before she got home. She stared at the screen. $200,000, 0 cents. Cleared. Real. That night, her father was moved into a private hospital room. She cried silently in the hallway, her phone still glowing in her palm. 3 days later, she moved into a penthouse in River North. It wasn't his main home, Charles explained. It was one of several residences. The apartment overlooked the river, floor-to-ceiling windows, Italian fixtures. Too much silence. We'll keep separate rooms, he told her, handing her a key card. But you'll need to wear the ring when we're in public. Anne looked at it. Simple platinum, no stone. Cold, she said quietly. Clean, he corrected. Like the truth. She slipped it on. It fit. Of course it did. The first event came a week later, a fundraiser for pediatric research. Red carpet, flashbulbs, 1,000 pairs of eyes. Anne walked beside him, her arm gently tucked into his. Her dress had been chosen by a stylist. Her smile had been rehearsed in the mirror. Still, it didn't feel like acting. Because the way Charles's hand hovered just behind her back, never quite touching, but always near, felt real. And the way he introduced her. My fiancée Anne Reed. Sounded like he meant it. Later that night, after the crowd had thinned, Charles poured himself a drink and handed her a glass of water. You handled yourself well. I didn't trip, she said dryly. That's better than most. They sat in silence for a while, watching the river move below. But then, by me. Charles didn't answer right away. Because you're not trying to impress me. Anne laughed softly. That's because I don't know who you really are. He looked at her then. Really looked. No one does. Chapter 6. The Mother's Verdict. The knock came at 8:02 a.m. Anne had just stepped out of the shower, hair damp, breath fogging the mirror in the guest bathroom of Charles's penthouse. Knock, knock, knock. 3 sharp taps. She wasn't expecting anyone. She wrapped herself in the plush robe left for her and padded to the front door. When she opened it, her heart froze. There, in a camel-colored coat and low heels, stood a woman whose presence chilled the air like February frost. Eleanor Whitmore Johnson, Charles's mother. Mrs. Johnson, Anne said, startled. I didn't realize. Clearly, Eleanor replied, stepping inside without waiting for permission. Put on something proper. I assume you have more than a bathrobe. Anne blinked. Of course, just give me a moment. She hurried back to the guest room and changed quickly into a soft, cream sweater and slacks. Nothing too polished, but nothing that could be accused of being casual either. When she returned, Eleanor was seated on the white leather sofa, sipping from a glass of water she'd helped herself to. Sit, she said. Anne did. 7. Why you're the girl who's managed to get Charles to do the one thing he said he'd never do. Anne folded her hands. I didn't ask for this. Eleanor said flatly, you just accepted it. Anne met her gaze. Wouldn't you, if it meant saving your father's life? That gave Eleanor pause, just a flicker. I'm not here to question your desperation, only your intentions. Anne's voice stayed calm. They're written into the contract. Eleanor set her glass down. A cross-end influence doesn't. I've built this family name for 3 decades. Do you really think I'll hand it over to someone who walks in from the street? I'm not asking for your family name, Anne replied. Just space to do the job I was given. Eleanor studied her for a long moment. What are you hoping for, Anne? To become Cinderella? To turn his pity into love? Anne's answer was steady. I'm hoping that when this ends, I'll still be able to look at myself in the mirror. Later that morning, Anne stood beside Charles in a black town car headed toward a boardroom meeting. You look like you've seen a ghost, he said without looking up from his phone. Your mother stopped by. That got his attention. He put the phone down. What did she say? I don't belong. He says that to everyone. Anne offered a soft smile. So I'm not special after all. That's not what I said. He didn't elaborate. 2 days later, Eleanor Johnson summoned Anne to lunch at the Whitmore house, a sprawling estate tucked behind wrought iron gates and ivy-draped stone. Anne arrived in a modest dress and low heels. She kept her shoulders square, her voice polite. The dining room was more museum than home. A place where every antique whispered, "You don't belong here." "We keep things traditional here," Eleanor said, slicing into her salad. "Our daughter-in-law is expected to manage charity events, sit on committees, preserve legacy." Anne nodded once. "Then I should clarify. I'm not marrying Charles for the family, or the fortune, or the legacy. I'm here because we made a deal." Eleanor set her knife down. "Do you think deals last in a world like this?" Anne met her gaze directly. "No, but I do think truth does." Later that week, Charles found Anne on the balcony of the penthouse, gazing out over the city lights. "How'd lunch go?" he asked. "Your mother doesn't like me." "But that's not news. She thinks I'm going to ruin your name." He leaned against the railing beside her. "Let her think that. Let them all think what they want." Anne turned toward him. "And what do you think, Charles?" His voice was quiet. "I think I've never had to defend someone before, and wanted to." Anne's chest tightened, but she didn't let it show. A week later, an envelope arrived at the penthouse. Gold seal, embossed lettering. Inside was an invitation. "The Whitmore Family Gala. You are cordially invited." Anne read it twice, then once more, slowly. Because at the bottom, beneath the formal calligraphy and rigid etiquette, was a note, handwritten in Eleanor's delicate script. "If you're going to stand beside my son, then show us who you really are." The night of the gala, Anne walked into a ballroom filled with judgment. But she didn't walk in alone. Charles held her hand. And for the first time, Anne didn't feel like she was pretending. She felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Chapter 7. The Wedding That Wasn't Meant to Be. The room at the city clerk's office smelled faintly of paper, dust, and decisions. Anne sat still, hands folded tightly in her lap, staring at the tiled floor. Beside her, Charles flipped through his phone like he was reviewing stock trends, not minutes away from legally marrying a woman he barely knew. "You don't have to do this," she said quietly. He didn't look up. "I know." "Then why are you?" Now he turned. His voice was calm, but edged in something unreadable. "Because I've made worse investments with less return." Anne blinked. "That's not very romantic." "This isn't a romance. It becomes one." We held her gaze. "Then one of us breaks the contract." They signed the papers in silence. No vows, no flowers, no ring exchange. Just ink, witnesses, and a city official who looked at them with all the warmth of a DMV clerk. "Congratulations," the woman said, stamping the form. "You're now legally husband and wife." Anne exhaled, like she'd just crossed into another country, one she couldn't return from. Charles looked at her, almost apologetically. "I'm done here." Outside, the wind had picked up. It pulled at her hair, tugged at the hem of her coat. "Why now?" she asked. Noticing Charles said, "We make it look real." The announcement went live that evening. A single statement released to the press. Charles Johnson, CEO of Johnson Group, has entered into a private civil marriage with Anne Reed. No photos, no details, but enough to spark chaos. By morning, the company buzzed. She actually married him? Wasn't she just an intern? My prenup? Impossible. Melissa Grant stormed into the boardroom and slammed her tablet on the table. "This is a joke?" The executive team exchanged nervous glances. "What exactly do you want us to do?" one asked. "Undo it?" "Melissa," the CFO said gently, "it's a legal marriage. It's a mistake." And yet, not one of them dared say so publicly. because Charles Johnson had never made a mistake that wasn't deliberate. At the penthouse, Anne stood barefoot in the kitchen, pouring herself a cup of coffee. It was the first morning she'd woken up as someone's wife. The robe she wore still smelled like lavender detergent. Her new last name had yet to feel real. She wasn't sure she wanted it to. Charles walked in, tie already knotted, hair still damp from the shower. "You don't have to keep staying here," he said, "if it's too uncomfortable." Anne shrugged. "The view's nice." "You mean the silences?" She half smiled. "Silence doesn't judge." He walked past her, grabbed a second mug, poured his own coffee black. "We have a dinner tonight," he said. "You'll need something formal." "What is it?" "A benefit. Press will be there." Anne nodded. "And we'll act the part?" "Exactly." "To that. And over there?" He paused. "We go home, to the same apartment, and keep sleeping in separate rooms." That night, Anne wore a navy silk dress with a low back and high neckline. Simple, elegant, nothing loud, just enough to say, "I belong here," without actually believing it. Charles met her at the door, dressed in charcoal and silence. He offered her his arm. "Ready?" "Oh, good," he said. "That means you're sane." At the event, cameras flashed like lightning behind velvet ropes. Reporters called out questions. Charles said nothing. Anne smiled gently, but not too much. A woman leaned toward her as they passed the champagne bar. "You're either brave or brilliant," she said softly. Anne blinked. "Excuse me? To marry a man like that?" Anne smiled. "Maybe both." At their table, seated between donors and developers, Charles leaned close. "You don't have to talk much. Just nod, smile, and let them assume what they want." "Why if they assume I married you for your money? And then they're not wrong." She looked at him. "Is that what you think I want?" He held her gaze. "No, that's what they expect. I don't care what you want." Anne's voice dropped. "You will." Back at the penthouse, the hallway was too quiet. Anne slipped off her heels and carried them in her hand. Her feet ached, her heart more so. Charles stood by the window, jacket off, tie loosened. "You handled that well." "It felt like theater." "It is." Anne crossed her arms. "And do I ever get to play myself?" He turned slowly. "Well, what does that look like?" "Someone who gets to choose her life, her love, her name." Charles walked closer. "Is that what you want?" She nodded. "Then earn it." "And what?" "Freedom to walk away." Anne stepped back. "If I do?" "Then I'll let you." She studied him. "About you? About me? Oh, you even want to be chosen? Or are you so used to being alone that you've forgotten what it means to matter?" Charles didn't answer. Anne turned toward her room. "Good night, Mr. Johnson." "Anne," he called softly. I stopped. "Why?" Lauren laughed. He looked at her for a long moment. "Happy wedding day." Chapter 8. The Trap at the Banquet. The invitation arrived 3 days later. Ivory paper, gilded script, the kind of envelope that smelled like old money and new malice. "Annual Winter Gala hosted by the Whitmore Foundation," Anne read aloud. Charles glanced up from his desk. "You're not required to go." Anne hesitated. "But I'm expected." He didn't deny it. "The board will be there, so will the press, and my mother, and Melissa. And then I should go." Charles raised an eyebrow. "Even if it's a setup?" Anne tucked the invitation into her bag. "Especially then." The Whitmore Grand Ballroom gleamed like a gemstone, all chandeliers and strings of violins. Anne walked in beside Charles, his arms steady under hers, her dress the soft color of stormlight. She felt it in her skin, that something was wrong. Whispers trailed behind her like perfume. That's her, the girl who married him. She doesn't belong here. Melissa appeared halfway through the night in crimson silk and a smile sharpened to cut. "Anne," she purred, offering a glass of champagne. "You must be exhausted, keeping up the act." Anne didn't flinch. "Is that why you always look tired?" Melissa's smile tightened. "Careful, darling. Charles can only shield you for so long." Anne set her glass down. "Then let's see what happens when the shield disappears." Later, Charles stepped away for a phone call. Just 5 minutes. That's all it took. Anne never saw the champagne get switched. She sipped, just once. Her head began to buzz. Her vision blurred at the edges. She tried to walk toward the balcony, but someone caught her elbow. "You should lie down," a voice said. Not Charles. Not someone she recognized. The hallway twisted, the air thinned. She blinked and saw a door open, then close behind her. Inside the guest suite, the light was dim. Anne tried to stand, but her legs buckled. Panic rose in her throat. Something's wrong. She fumbled for her phone. The room spun. Then footsteps. The door creaked open again. Melissa, with a camera, and 2 men behind her. Anne's stomach lurched. "You've been quite the star lately," Melissa said coolly. "Time to burn a little." "What are you doing?" Anne whispered. "It's nothing. You'll just wake up tomorrow to a few headlines, a scandal, a ruined name, and Charles will walk away clean." Anne's voice was hoarse. "He'll know." Melissa knelt beside her. "The time he gets here, you'll be memory." But Charles didn't walk. He ran. He burst into the room like a storm, eyes blazing. "Get away from her," he barked. The men backed up immediately. Melissa stood frozen. Charles moved to Anne, kneeling beside her. "Hey," he said gently. "Can you hear me?" She nodded. Barely. He pulled her close, lifted her carefully into his arms. "You're safe now." He turned to Melissa. "If she has a scratch, I'll ruin every family name tied to this room." "Charles, I didn't—" "And save it," he snapped. "She doesn't belong here, but she belongs with me." He carried Anne out without looking back. At the hospital, Anne drifted in and out of sleep. The doctors said the drug would wear off, that she was lucky, that someone intervened in time. When she woke fully, Charles was sitting by her side, his tie undone, his shirt rumpled. "You didn't have to come," she whispered. "I didn't come," he said softly. "I never left." Tears welled in her eyes. "You were supposed to stay distant." "I tried." He reached for her hand. "You ruined that." "I did." Completely. By morning, Melissa Grant had disappeared from the media scene. Her family released a vague statement about personal matters. Charles Johnson issued none. But Johnson Group's legal department filed defamation suits that very afternoon. And the only public thing he posted that week was a photo. A single image. In the hospital bed, holding his hand. It captioned, "The truth that only truth I need." Chapter 9. The Announcement. The press called it the silence before the storm. Inside the penthouse, silence was survival. Anne hadn't left the apartment in a week. Her recovery had been quick physically, but something inside her still felt fractured, like she was walking on glass, pretending she didn't bleed when it cracked. Charles had canceled all public appearances. He sat across from her at breakfast that morning, neither of them speaking, both sipping from cups that had long gone cold. Finally, he set his coffee down. "I want an answer." Anne looked up. "To what?" "Everything." "And what do you want to tell them?" He didn't hesitate. "The truth." Anne's heart thudded. Which version of it? He leaned forward, quiet but steady. The one where I say, "You're not just my wife by paper, but by choice." The Johnson Group annual shareholders conference was not meant to be a stage for personal affairs. But when Charles walked into the hall with Anne on his arm, the cameras didn't blink, they flared. Board members whispered. Investors shifted, and every seat held a person waiting for one question to be answered. Why her? Charles took the mic. Before we begin today's agenda, there's something I want to say. He paused, eyes scanning the room, not nervous, but measured. Anne stood at his side, hands calm, heart anything but. There's been speculation about my marriage, about Anne, about who she is, why she's here. He looked at Anne then, only her. She's here because she saved me, without knowing who I was. She stood up when everyone else stayed quiet. She saw a person, not a position. He turned back to the crowd. If anyone has an issue with who I married, you're welcome to sell your shares. A ripple of stunned silence passed through the room. Charles stepped aside. Let's begin. That evening, the press was relentless. Headlines flooded in. Charles Johnson confirms marriage is real and perfect. From secretary to CEO's spouse. Who is Anne Reed? We stood by her, and the world watched. Anne scrolled through them with shaking fingers, sitting cross-legged on the living room floor. I think I'm playing a role, she murmured. Charles sat behind her on the couch, silent for. Are you? Anne looked over her shoulder. Noiselessly, the scary part. Days passed. Then came the gala. The one hosted by the Global Equity Consortium, the event where legacy families flaunted their wealth like armor and names like inheritance. Anne walked in beside Charles. This time, there was no uncertainty in her step. She wore midnight blue. He wore black. Together, they looked like inevitability. Near the bar, Eleanor Johnson sipped her drink and watched them. Later that night, she approached Anne quietly. You handled yourself well. Anne turned to her. Was I supposed to fail? Eleanor's lips twitched. You were supposed to survive. You did better than that. Then she added, softer. Charles chose you, and that means I do too. That night, back in the penthouse, Anne stood barefoot in the kitchen, watching Charles pour 2 glasses of wine. He handed her one. You told them. He nodded. I did. I meant it. Another nod. Anne stepped closer. Then let me ask you something. Anything. We set the wine down. This marriage started as a deal. When did it stop feeling like one? Charles didn't answer. He kissed her instead. Slow, certain, like he'd been holding his breath for weeks. And when they parted, he whispered, the moment you stopped asking me what I wanted and just stayed. Chapter 10. The Name on the Ring. It was quiet on the rooftop. Late autumn wind swept through the city, brushing against Anne's coat as she stepped toward the stone railing, high above the skyline. She could hear the river below, the rustle of dried leaves along the balcony, and the soft click of the door behind her. Charles was there. He said nothing at first, just stood beside her, his presence steady in the silence. You didn't come up last night, he said softly. Anne nodded. I needed air. I figured. He held something in his hand, small, velvet, familiar. Anne glanced down, and her breath caught. What is that? Charles opened the box. Inside was a ring, simple, platinum, unpolished. But on the inside of the band, engraved so faintly you'd miss it unless you were searching, was a name. Anne Reed. She stared. You had it made? Charles nodded. I asked the jeweler to keep it quiet. Why? Because I didn't want this to be about show. I wanted it to be a choice. Anne looked up at him, her voice barely above a whisper. And what are you choosing? Charles stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers. To be honest, for once in my life, he lifted the ring from the box. You changed everything, Anne, without asking for anything back. You said this wasn't a romance. I lied. He took her hand gently. I'll let you. As what? I the man who marries you, because he loves you. Anne blinked, tears gathering behind her eyes. I don't want a contract, she said softly, and tear it up. I don't want a name that's just borrowed. Then keep your own, or take mine, but this time, because it's yours to decide. What if I say no? Charles smiled, just barely. Then I'll wait. She looked at the ring one more time, her name etched in metal, real, permanent. You still keep your distance sometimes, she said. It's fear, not pride. You still think love makes you weak. Used to. He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit. Of course it did. Probably now, he said, voice barely a breath. It makes me brave. Later, they lay beneath the skylight, tangled in quiet and promise. Charles traced the inside of her wrist like it was a language he was still learning. I don't need the world to believe us anymore, Anne whispered. Me neither. I want to believe us. He pulled her close. Then we make it real, every day, every choice. The next morning, Anne signed a single sheet of paper in the kitchen. It wasn't a contract. It was a letter of resignation from her job. Charles read it slowly, then folded it carefully. You sure? Anne smiled. I don't want to work for you. Why do you want? She looked at him, this man who had once stood in silence, watching her defend a stranger, and unknowingly handed her a life. I want to build something with you. That evening, he took her back to the elevator. Same floor, same glass walls. He pushed the button, but didn't enter. This is where you walked in. Anne smiled. And where everything changed. He nodded. This time, walk out with me. And she stepped in. And this time, he followed. The elevator that opened twice. Some love stories don't begin with butterflies. They begin with borrowed heels, a missing button, and a voice saying, she doesn't belong here. Anne Reed never planned to marry a billionaire. She only wanted a job, a chance, a sliver of stability. But fate doesn't knock. Sometimes it rides an elevator to the 15th floor and opens the door when you're not looking. They used to call her the girl from nowhere. Now she walks into rooms not with entitlement, but with earned peace. Not because of his money, not because of his name, but because someone saw her when the world told her to disappear, and she saw herself long before that. Their marriage no longer needs a contract. It's built on quiet rituals. Shared coffee, morning silence, a hand on the small of her back in crowded rooms. His thumb brushing her ring as if to say, you're still mine. And sometimes, late at night, Charles still asks her, why made you say yes? Anne always gives the same answer. Because you were the first man who didn't try to fix me. Just made sure I had space to heal. Love isn't about rescue. It's about recognition. It's someone looking at you and saying, I see who you are, and I'm staying anyway. Whether you're sweeping the street or running the boardroom, you are worthy of love that doesn't flinch. So if you've been waiting for someone to open the right door, maybe it's not a door at all. Maybe it's an elevator, and maybe it's already coming up to meet you. If this story reminded you of someone who changed your life quietly, unexpectedly, share it with them, or leave a comment about the moment you first realized. You didn't need to be chosen by the world, just seen by one person who mattered. We'll be reading every word. Because love like this, it deserves to be remembered.